Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here with your next D-Kush lesson. So today the lesson that we're looking at here is called the Salubrious Social Gospel in Wondrous Women. Okay. In this video, I'm actually not going to be looking too much at the social gospel. I feel like the resources that I provided for that here in this lesson is going to be plenty of enough to get through that. So instead, I'm going to focus on some changes that are going to be happening towards the end of the 19th century for women. And not only in the workplace, but then also in dating and kind of other like large gender norms. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'm going to skip past all this jazz, okay? But the specific objective, I'll go back here just for a second, is we're going to look at the push of feminism and female empowerment during the 1880s to 1900s through volunteer organizations, anti-saloon efforts, and changes in entertainment. Okay, so we're going to focus on those three things. Okay, so female empowerment during those times. All right, again, I'm going to skip past lots of these things, all right? So I assume at this point that the gospel and social Darwinism, you should be able to handle those on your own, okay? So our mini lesson, the fightin' females, service, saloons, and scooterly poopin', all righty? So our essential questions for today, okay? How can we understand gender within its own context, especially the context that we're looking at of industrialization and also the Victorian culture that's pretty much been running things up until this point. Okay, and then also, how are gender roles shaped by society and vice versa? Okay, so is it individuals who influence the way that we see gender, or is it how we see gender that influences how individuals behave? How do those two have a conversation with each other, people and society? Okay, so how have you looked at gender over time? Well, earlier on last semester, we talked about the patriarchal household economy, okay, and then we also discussed separate spheres, Republican motherhood, and then really the question is, so like, where does that leave us in the 1880s? Okay, and so there's some people that have argued really as far back as the Civil War that this starts to begin to change in a few ways. Victoria and Bynum and a couple other writers in that era have been doing some really interesting work on that lately. But kind of around definitively by the time we get to the 1880s, we're starting to see some gradual kind of changes to what women are doing, both in their public lives and their private lives, okay? And so we're going to look at three areas: volunteer associations, anti-saloon movements, and then sexual and dating norms, okay? So first of all, volunteer movements, alrighty? So some women begin to participate. We start to see this development. They start to participate in some of these organizations that are outside the home. Now, please be aware, this is a really marked departure from the idea that men were supposed to have this outside public life. They were supposed to be involved in like the sinful world, and then women were supposed to be these like repositories of positive virtue. This is a dramatic change from that, okay? Now, again, how women are going to participate in these things, you're going to see is, in some ways, they are carrying on kind of some of those moral ideas that they were charged with as a part of like Republican motherhood, for instance. Okay, so we see like, for example, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is an anti-alcohol association. We also do see, though, that things are really still very tied into race, and really does depend on the context that you look at. So, for example, like in the South, we see this volunteer association, and I can show you the picture here, and you can see them down there. They are called the Daughters of the Confederacy, and they're really dedicated to carrying on the memory of the lost cause, okay, which is like why the South should have won. Okay, so what are we saying here? Well, basically, the participation of females in these things really highly depends upon social class and race. And that is because in order to have the time to participate in these things, you had to probably be a person of at least middle or upper class status. Okay, and then also race had a really big influence on whether or not you were able to join these organizations in the first place. Obviously, black women would have not been allowed to have joined the Daughters of the Confederacy for good reason. Okay, so then the second area we're going to look at, all right, is the anti-saloon movement. Okay, so many women became active even before this time during the Second Great Awakening with temperance. Okay, and this is they get active not just in saloons but then also in society as well. Okay, so and we call this the anti-alcohol or temperance movement. Okay, and so basically, to give you an idea of how widespread alcohol is at this time, I know that we've looked at some data from like early on in the Revolution, where the average American was consuming something around like 35 gallons of alcohol a year. Okay, not counting like other kinds of drinks. But in 1900, there are actually more saloons in the U.S. than there are grocery stores or markets. There's a huge amount of alcohol still being consumed. But the thing is, you also have to understand how saloons operated. Saloons are places where people get together for just, like meals even. Many saloons would actually offer basically food along with drinks for workers in like new industrial factories and other kind of settings, and that's how like you get basically like a lunch hour. Okay, and then you would go back to work. But it's so much more than just a place to drink. It's for companionship. It's where you can meet people from your neighborhood. They're often also very based on like politics and class and race. And speaking of politics, they're also where most political machines operate out of. And which kind of leads us to a whole nother discussion. But again, the whole idea is that saloons are just much more than just this place you go like to a bar today and drink. And so when women start to rally against saloons, it's really this image that saloons have of this nasty effect on society. So things like alcoholism, divorce, crime, basically broken marriages from not enough money being brought home. Okay, and this is where it's kind of interesting, where I think maybe in this situation it's the perception of saloons almost that's more dangerous than themselves. There's been a work by a couple recent historians who've shown that actually most men only spent less than 5% of their income that they made at saloons. So perhaps it's like all the after effects of buying alcohol that mattered more, even if it wasn't the effects, maybe just the perception that it was causing these things. And so many women get active against alcohol. Okay, and then the changes in sexual norms are also really, really important. Okay, and so kind of this big cultural phenomenon that we've been talking about before up until this time has been Victorianism. Okay, and it's and not only that, and specifically in the realm of sex, it's known for extreme sexual restriction. Okay, so for example, like saying the word leg or bottom was considered by some Victorians to be really inappropriate. Okay, and this starts to change towards the end of the 19th century, and this is like a really, really kind of cool, interesting kind of like period where we start to see this shift. Now, be aware, again, this depends on who you are and if you're wealthy, because for working mothers, there's really not that much of a change. But if you had money, things start to shift a little bit. So for single women, we're going to kind of focus on them. We start to see some things that allow women to have a little bit more sexual freedom. We see the first movie theaters. They were called Nickelodeons because you only had to pay a nickel to go in them. Okay, we start to see amusement parks, and we'll actually look at a book coming up here in a couple of weeks called Amusing the Million. That's about how amusement parks kind of change things. And then also we start to see some other forms of recreation like bicycles and other kinds of ways that basically couples can get together. Now, for all three of these things, movie theaters, amusement parks, and recreation, this allows females to get basically away from what had been there previously, and that is basically chaperones. If you went on a date, really during Victorian times, you would often be left with like an aunt, like a spinster, so that way they would make sure that nothing scandalous happened. But all three of those things, movie theaters are dark, okay? It's easy to get away during those times. Amusement parks are really easy to get rid of chaperones, and so are especially our bicycles. Okay, all three of those things basically means that females can have more sexual freedom because they can get away from the people who are supposed to be watching them. Okay, and those are really, really big transformations. We start to see some kind of like interesting photos that I thought were kind of worth mentioning here towards the end. I'm actually going to blow this up a little bit larger picture here for you. So the one on the left is actually kind of funny. We'll get to that here in a second. But it's the one on the right I want to talk about first. Now, why is this like picture so scandalous for its time? Well, you can see right over here, you can see her legs, or her stockings, which would be considered like really, really inappropriate for Victorian times. She's also smoking. Oh my goodness, women smoking. And then she's also drinking as well. And then this actress, this photographer, really, I can't remember her name for the life of me. she kind of put these together to kind of like prompt a reaction. And you can see like this is a really kind of interesting take on stuff and how it's changing for women, both in the home and in society. And then this one over here is kind of a parody. So what they've actually done is they've switched the gender roles of what you would normally assume for people at this time. And so this photograph here is of a man. You can't really see, but he's wearing an apron, okay, and he's doing like housework, which would be normally a woman's realm. And here it looks like she's been out. Okay, you can like see like a bicycle in the background, maybe she's been riding, but she's wearing like knee breeches, which would have been, again, not acceptable in Victorian times. Okay, she appears to almost be taking off her gloves, which also would have been a big deal in Victorian times. Where basically you were thought you were thought as improper or exposing yourself if you didn't have gloves on. So it's kind of an interesting thing here, and I thought these two photos were kind of good for indicating some of the bigger shifts that had happened. Okay, so if you kind of get this, and you can see where these trends are going, then you're kind of getting the point of this mini lesson, is that we're seeing, we're looking at how female empowerment is really changing through those three things. Okay, so until then, just consider those examples. Think about like those essential questions that we had with it, and until then, bye bye.